This is 1A. I'm Sasha Ann Simons, in for Jen White. Now let's take you back to the late 60s, a turbulent time, and to the fictitious small town of Canaan, Virginia. That's where you'll meet Evan Walls. It's also where you might meet my next guest, Jeffrey Blount. Jeffrey is the author of The Emancipation of Evan Walls. His latest novel is about a smart, ambitious kid who grew up bullied by white people, but also by his own community, who accuse him of acting white. Chances are you might already know someone like Evan Walls because this is a story that will resonate with millions of Americans. Jeffrey Blount, welcome to 1A.
Sasha, thank you for having me.
Great to see you. Writing this story came about as a result of something that you read back in the 80s and a conversation that you had with your mom as well. Fill in the blanks for us.
So I have been a victim of this as well when I was growing up. But it was never enough for me to turn it into a book. I had sort of moved on with my life. And I was sitting in our apartment one day, and I came across an article about a young black boy, about 10 years old, who was considered young, gifted, and black, as we said back in the day. Mm-hmm. And he paid for that gift. He loved going to school. Apparently brilliant, straight-A student. He would get beat up on the way home and made to suffer because he was doing something that the other kids thought was outside of their culture or acting white. When the reporter went to visit the family, found the mother and said, you know, this poor kid, I have such sympathy for what he's going through, but I'm kind of proud of him. He's got this dream and he's going to take being beat up to continue that dream. And it must be killing you as his mom to see him going through this. And she said, well, I wish he would just grow up to be a janitor or something and stop causing me so much trouble. And that weighed on me heavily, and it just merged with my own experience. I couldn't shake it. I talked with my wife over and over again about it, and finally I got in the car, drove to my parents, sat down with my mom, who was a teacher and knew what I'd gone through. And she said, Jeffrey, you know, you love to write. You're a storyteller. This is the story that you should tell because there are a lot of other kids out there with this boy's story and your story. Somebody needs to raise awareness. And that was the genesis. She gave me the power and the freedom to sit down and begin writing.
Oh, yeah, you're striking a chord for a lot of folks with the writing of this book. In the past, you've also quoted Zora Neale Hurston, who said, quote, there is no agony like bearing an untold story inside of you. I've used that quote many times on email signatures. But, you know, tell me, was this a book that you felt you had to write?
Absolutely. If I had only one book in me, it had to be this book. And because of my lived experience, but because I continued to do research as I wrote the book, and I just came across these amazingly horrible stories of young African-American kids who were suffering from this issue. In 92, I think it was, Time Magazine did an article called The Hidden Hurdle, where this girl in Oakland was being called by kids from school and told they were going to kill her because she was a good student.
Wow.
And then there is, I came across a op-ed piece written by I think it was a junior at Brown University, African-American, and he was writing about the fact that the things that he considered to be normal, you know, being articulate and studying and trying to do better for yourself academically, was really color-coded white for a lot of people, and they held that against him. And then we get to 2013 when Michelle Obama is speaking at Bowie State, and she says, my husband often says we have to reject the notion that a black child with a book is acting white. Mm-hmm. And so all of those things, and it continues. I mean, even today, not too long ago in the Washington Post, Jerome Adams, who is the Surgeon General, was quoted as saying, you know, that he was told that he had acted white and that he spent really his whole life trying to prove that he was black enough.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us, Jeffrey. Yeah. You're bringing up some experiences of my past as well, especially being raised in Canada, you know, coming over to the States, visiting family in the States. They'd say, why do you talk like that? You sound so white. And then getting into journalism where I have to speak properly so that people can understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
I totally know what you're talking about. So being seen as uppity is a universal trait, right? As you've sort of made clear, you know, be it petty jealousies or just people simply being mean-spirited. But tell us the point that you're trying to make in the context of this story.
The first thing I want when you close that book and you're finished is for you to understand that there is something that has been hiding in plain sight. And these kids really haven't had a place to go to. They haven't had someone represent them until someone like Michelle Obama spoke up about it and the president did on CNN. She then wrote about it in her memoir. I wanted people to recognize it, and then I wanted the appropriate people to be able to help the kids. One of the things that happened on tour was that I ran into a lot of teachers, and they would ask me, well, what do I do? And so that's a big question. That's a big answer. But still, I wanted them to ask that question because that's when we begin to set things in motion that kids begin to get help.
Okay.
That's what I wanted.
You make it clear this is, in fact, your story. Evan Wall's story is your story as well. And in the book, we read that adult Evan Walls keeps this painful part of his childhood from his wife, who's a white woman, until after the birth of their child. Is that how things unfolded for you and your wife?
No. My wife knew right away. We had that conversation. And we had many conversations about race, and my wife is white, so people will know that. But we definitely had that conversation from the time we started dating.
Early on.
Yeah.
And with the children?
And with the children, always with the children. Yeah. Because I feared, now this fear that I wrote in the book about Evan worrying about his daughter suffering through that, I definitely had that fear when my daughter was born.
We are talking to award-winning author Jeffrey Blount. His latest book is called The Emancipation of Evan Walls. Let's talk about the timing of this book. This is 1968. The backdrop is, of course, the civil rights movement. Why did you choose to set the story during that time?
Because it's my experience in my time. It's my coming of age time. And there was so much that I wanted to represent in the way this affected me. So the acting white part was only part of it. It's a subset to the whole issue of systemic racism, which you see represented in the book. So I wanted that. And then there were some special things I wanted too. A lot of people have asked me about the dialogue. And I said, well, a lot of people will tell you that the music of their lives is the Jackson 5 or Earth, Wind, and Fire. For me, it was the voices of the adults in my life. I love to sit and listen to my great-grandmother, my great-aunt, and my grandmother talk and laugh. And they're just the way they spoke, the words they use, the phrases.
And I bet you could still hear their laughs in your head, right?
When I was learning to write, I got a piece of advice from a published author. He said the most important thing you can do is listen. And even if the people are gone, you can still listen to the voices in your head and your heart and bring them back. And so I wanted to reflect my experience as a child, including those people, including the way they lived, the way they saw the world. And also there was another little thing, that this was a smaller thing, but in my years at NBC, it got to the point where we would say that black was equivalent to urban. And so they would just use urban, and the audience was supposed to assume that was black.
Right.
But, I grew up on a farm, and there's still a lot of African Americans who live in rural parts of the country and live in many ways very different lives. And I wanted that represented as well.
You mentioned NBC. We should mention quickly your time. You're a veteran of NBC News.
Yeah,
right?
I worked at NBC for 34 years and directed over a decade of Meet the Press and Today Show, Nightly News, and special events. And
now focusing on the writing.
Yes, absolutely.
So back to this story. What is it about the story that you think moves the conversation beyond code switching?
Well, I think the basic humanity moves it beyond just I am living sort of white or I'm speaking sort of white. It's the idea that we are all born with the equal freedom to dream our own dream in a way that benefits ourselves personally. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm trying to reach a level of humanity that's beyond all of that. That a child is born as Earth, Wind, and Fire. A child is born with a heart of gold. Way of the world makes his heart grow cold. I'm trying to eliminate the second part of the phrase. Let all children be born with the freedom to dream unencumbered, especially kids of color who have to deal with this issue of systemic racism and a legacy of inequality in education and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm coming from.
There's been some pushback, too,
Yes.
over the years about acting white and being seen as uppity, right?
Yes.
That whole conversation. There was a study back in 2005 out of North Carolina which called the argument fragile at best. It's essentially nerds versus jocks. And it says that it can apply to both black kids in predominantly white schools and to poor white kids, too.
Well, yes, everybody can be called a nerd. Everybody can be told they're a bookworm. The difference is someone else may have heard it. I've never heard it. I've never heard a white kid be told you're not white anymore.
Right.
The difference is black kids are told they're not black and they don't belong in their culture anymore. That's a huge difference when you're eliminated from your community.
I'm Sasha Ann Simons. My guest for the first part of the hour today is Jeffrey Blount. He's the author of The Emancipation of Evan Walls, a novel that spotlights the harm done to gifted black kids who are bullied at school and by their own community. I wanted to get his thoughts on how the Black Lives Matter movement has revived the old term woke and evolved its meaning to include direct action. So if you're woke, you're ready to take concrete steps to achieve racial equality. But in the context of his story, I wondered, who does the woke label serve today? And is simply being woke or staying woke enough?
I think it's a start. It's not enough.
Okay.
It's a start to have the light bulb go on. That's the woke. And that's what I try to produce with this book, is to create a woke about a certain subject. Then there has to be action. And I can awaken you. You know, in the Matrix, I can give you the red pill and make you realize you're living this reality. Mm-hmm. But then you have to decide what you're going to do with that. Are you going to be the one? Are you going to be the person that steps forward and continues the movement, particularly if you have the power by virtue of your race or by virtue of finances or whatever else, that you have the power to make a change that many of the masses don't? Then I think woke is understanding the issue and then using whatever you have to make the people who are suffering from that issue or make the issue go away.
Thinking more than about Evan Walls and just that treatment within the black community.
Yeah.
With all the racial injustice here in this country that's been taking the spotlight, especially this year, comes a focus of the treatment of black people by white people, right? Systemic racism, as you just pointed out.
Yeah.
But how does this united front now among black Americans, right, as we have this fight, how does that help kill the "you're not black enough" narrative? Or does it advance us?
I don't think
because now
it
we're
does.
sticking together.
We're sticking together.
Apparently.
But it changes when we're in an atmosphere where we are closely related to white people in terms of our working environment or our school environment, and where we have to compare ourselves to whites in terms of growing and getting better and promoted on the job or becoming more educated at school. And then if you're looking at the vice president level in a corporation and everybody's white and there's one black person who moves in there, then that one black person is still going to suffer. And that one black kid is still going to suffer for being in the advanced class because they looked at him, now he's living in a white neighborhood and making friends in the white neighborhood. So therefore, he's working on losing his blackness. So we have a lot of work to do, and partly it's just recognizing the problem. We have to acknowledge that it exists. There are quite a few people who just will not acknowledge that the problem exists, and that is a problem for solving it.
So knowing what you know now, how should younger Jeffrey have responded to criticism of acting white?
Well, younger Jeffrey should have been more vocal at school about the fact that education wasn't color-coded white. Younger Jeffrey probably, although this was kind of a negative of growing up in a small town where in the library, I mentioned in the book that Evan didn't even know that there were black authors. So I was going to say that young Jeffrey could say, there's Thurgood Marshall over here and this person and that person, but young Jeffrey didn't know about a lot of those people because it wasn't being taught in the school. But if I were young today, I would say, you can normalize black excellence in terms of intellectual ability by claiming Barbara Jordan and folks like that and making that a normal in your conversation in the classroom. And that's how it becomes a better thing for everybody. And then even the kids who are really uncomfortable with performing, which also leads to them looking at the kids who are performing well and thinking there's something wrong with them, if they can see that this is a comfortable space for African Americans, and African Americans have been inhabiting this space ever since Frederick Douglass, then it can be a good thing. It doesn't have to be a negative.
So this is not just a story about conversations within the black community. The Emancipation of Evan Walls is a story for everybody.
It's a story for everybody. And we see, I have had amazing responses on the tour from white readers and black readers. I've had at every place, someone white will stand up in the audience and say, how can I help? This isn't my story, but I am totally into the story. One, because we're talking about children.
Right.
And that's one reason I wrote the book about a child, because when children hurt, people want to do something. Also, every place I went to where there was an African American in the audience, or someone stood up and said it was my problem. And so, this book has been incredible to me as an author, to have it speak to so many people. I held hands. People cried when they would hand me their book and hold my hand and cry and say, thank you for telling my story, because I didn't have the courage to speak up about it. I had people one woman bought like 40 copies and held an impromptu book club to be able to explain to people in her life what this was like. Of course, that's the best thing in my mind that could happen to an author. So the book is doing its job. And, as I set out to do, I'm just hoping that, we can continue to raise the conversation. Blackish did a show on colorism. At the end of the show, there was a voiceover, and they said, we knew this was going to be a difficult conversation, but the reason we did it is because nothing gets solved in the shadows. And that's why I wrote this book.
What about for the parents? You touch a bit in the book on the Black father struggle.
Yes.
Right? Feeling helpless in this fight for his children, whether dealing with bullying and whatnot. Talk a bit about that, and if you have any advice.
Well, I do. I think that was also a thing of the times. I think we were coming, my dad grew up in Jim Crow, and a lot of the men who I grew up around grew up in Jim Crow. And thankfully, my grandfather was a landowner. He had a store. He was a deacon in the church. He was a well-respected man. My father grew up in that, and he felt comfortable speaking up for himself. But a lot of African-American men did not. And I mentioned that in the book, that you could see sometimes as a child you would need them to step up for you, and they couldn't step up for you. You understood that if they did, they would get in trouble. They could even be physically harmed. But you wanted the adults to be able to help you.
And you talk about what it did for the dad, like his manhood.
His manhood. It took his manhood, and it also made him angry and frustrated. And then who is he going to be frustrated with? Only the people around him, because he couldn't strike out at the people he wanted to. And so he caused damage in his home. He caused damage in his community.
So then bringing it back to the younger reader, right?
Yes.
Your overall message for them as you write this book, what's the special takeaway?
For young readers?
For young readers, yeah.
The special takeaway, again, is that Black excellence is normal. In the book, Evan goes to Hampton Institute at the time, now Hampton University. And it's a very special moment. I won't spoil that.
Let's leave that for
But
folks.
It's a very special moment. And so, and I will tell you that I am mentoring a couple of kids now who came to me through the book. And my constant conversation with them is, what's best for you? Consider what's best for you, and what is your best you right now. And for the two kids that I'm talking about, they're really, really intellectually inclined, science and math, and they take grief about that. And I keep saying that, one, this is a short time. You got 4 years. The longest part of your life is spent as an adult.
Right.
And this is what we're setting you up for. So I'm going to be here for you to call and yell and scream and do everything that you need to do so that you can go back to school focused the next day and concentrate on what's best for you. And that's your education. Those are your strengths. And we're going to play to your strengths. Just like if we were on the football field, we're going to play to your strengths. And just to try to keep them in the game. What I learned from my parents is all a kid really needs to know is that there is an adult who will be there for them, who has unconditional love and support for them. And a kid can really fight incredible battles having that as a base.
Jeffrey Blount is the author of The Emancipation of Evan Walls. It's available now. Jeffrey, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.